Let's talk about the Swedish M1893 cavalry sword. So this is a sword that hasn't been featured on my channel before, and some of you might be thinking, why do we want to know about a Swedish cavalry sword? And the fact is that it's quite important in the evolution of swords at the end of the 19th century and going into the 20th century. So many of you who are interested in 19th century swords will have read things in books on the internet about how in the end of the 19th century, particularly in the 1890s really, and towards the end of the 1890s and into the early 1900s, there was a movement in European and American cavalry sword design from cut and thrust blades to thrust-centric blades. Now, this is sometimes described as a new thing, but in some ways it kind of really wasn't, because if we go back to the cuirassiers of France most famously, but of other nations as well, for a long time they had carried a type of sword called a palash. And the palash has its roots actually in 17th century swords, and in fact if we go all the way back to Polish and Hungarian hussars of the 17th century, they often carried two swords. They carried a curved sabre, szabla in Poland, and then they carried a straight estoc, and those were used for different things. Now, in many cases they also had a lance, they sometimes had a bow, they sometimes had guns, and this is probably partly or heavily, I would say, influenced by the Ottoman Turkish janissaries. And janissaries were armed with many weapons, which meant that they could fight in many different scenarios. They could deploy as missile troops, as mounted missile troops, they could be heavy shot cavalry, they could be light scouting, skirmishing cavalry. And this equally wasn't a completely new thing. There were various types of cavalry going all the way back into the Middle Ages that had operated like this. And if we look, for example, at the Egyptian Mamluks, the Mamluks operated to some degree like this as well. They could fulfill many different roles, largely as cavalry, either shooting their missiles or as actual hand-to-hand combat cavalry, or scouting operations, of course, as well, which pretty much all cavalry end up doing, or indeed they could fight on foot. And this is something which is sort of overlooked, I think, from a sort of modern, maybe slightly video game or wargaming mindset. We tend to see cavalry as just, they'd sit on their horses, they do everything on their horses, and in actual fact there are many occasions throughout history, obviously in the Middle Ages, famously English knights fought on foot quite a lot of the time, but then they could mount up again at different points within an engagement or within a campaign. They could operate as cavalry or they could operate as infantry, and in fact certain types of cavalry had always been intended to do that. And this multi-armed cavalry force that we talk about, which I'll come back to the 19th century in a second, which they were in the 19th century also, but this multi-armed cavalry force is something that we see going all the way back into the Roman period, in fact, and even earlier, all the way back to Alexander the Great and everything. But a really good example from the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, is Charlemagne's knights, so-called knights. And Charlemagne's cavalry were equipped with lances and swords and bows, and could operate on foot in sieges and things like this if needs be. Now, if we fast forward back to the 19th century, as I promised we would, this was also the case of cavalry in the 19th century, of European cavalry. And when I say European, incidentally, I'm including American as well, although generally speaking the Americans for the most part seem to have made less use of cavalry than, for example, the Austro-Hungarians or the French or the British. But if we come to the 19th century, cavalry weren't they were divided into light and heavy cavalry, and sometimes even broken down even further than that into, you have carabiniers or dragoons and other things like this as well. But they were multi-armed, okay, so they had a hand weapon. Sometimes they had two hand weapons, so lancers carried a lance and a sword very often, not always, but very often. But in addition, they also had firearms as well in Europe, so they had either pistols or carbines, or very occasionally they had full-length full-length muskets and rifles as well. So they were multi-armed and performed in many different ways. And I've spoken about World War I cavalry in the past, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the British. This is the officers' version, the 1912, but the 1908 and the 1912. I've spoken about them before, and the fact that in World War I, contrary to the popular perception, there's many myths actually which are kind of held and quite pervasive about World War I. But one of those is that cavalry was impotent and useless in World War I. It wasn't. It was actually very active at the beginning of World War I and very active at the end of World War I. It was the middle kind of trench warfare period where cavalry wasn't terribly useful. But as I've pointed out, cavalry were often deployed to be used in specific ways dependent on the circumstances. They weren't always used in the way that you necessarily imagined them being used. So how does that affect swords? Well, quite simply, obviously firearm technology had come a long way by the end of the 19th century. And even more so into the 20th century, with even more machine guns being around, bolt-action magazine rifles, either with 5 or 10 rounds. So quite simply, cavalry were having a hard time in an open battlefield in certain scenarios, and there were certain things that cavalry used to do that they couldn't realistically do anymore. But there were some things that they still could do. Now, the sword that fits into this scenario obviously is going to be different than the type of sword we might see being used in the 17th century, or perhaps in the middle of the 19th century in places like India or China or parts of Africa. It's a different sword for a different purpose. And this type of sword, this one being the Swedish example, the 1893, towards the end of the 19th century there was a move to thrusting swords, because you've got to think about, when are these people going to use their swords? Now, cavalry charges were a thing. One of the famous examples during World War I was Beersheba by the Australians, and they didn't have their cavalry swords, they didn't have any swords, so they used their bayonets. But the fact was, they realised that the thing to do in that moment was a cavalry charge. And sometimes, even if cavalry's main job is to ride around scouting, reporting, looking for enemy troop movements, and then moving off without engaging, and then maybe sometimes dismounting, getting down behind a hillock and firing off a few shots at the enemy to distract them or to make them think that we're over there rather than over there, these kinds of things, and then mounting up and riding off quickly to somewhere else again, even if that's their main job, occasionally they might see that baggage train over there hasn't been properly guarded. Let's charge them. Let's charge in. And this happened many times in World War I, in fact, but also don't just think about Europe, think about the Middle East and North Africa. So Lawrence of Arabia, hugely successful, and he was hit and run cavalry for the most part. So he was fighting with and leading the Arab forces underneath him, underneath his command, and he was organising them in essentially guerrilla warfare. But they were cavalry, they were hit and run cavalry, and extremely effective at doing it. They'd ride quickly to one place, they'd blow up a railway line, and then they'd ride off to another place, attack a Turkish baggage train, and then ride off to another place. So very, very effective. Now, there were occasions, nevertheless, when a cavalry charge was required, and if you're going to go in for a cavalry charge, you're not going to get into a mixed melee with other cavalry. You're looking for a weak, exposed flank, a vulnerable enemy who aren't properly protected or dug in or whatever. You want to hit them, do as many casualties as possible, and then get out again before reinforcements can come in and shoot up your horses. And actually, a thrusting sword is a great thing for that. It is, you know, if you're going to charge in quickly, but speed of point, using it like a short lance, essentially, stab an opponent and ride out again. You're not going to get stuck in there. You're not going to get stuck in sword-on-sword combat. You really want a lance or a thrusting sword. So within that context, these types of swords were very, very effective. But there is a misconception. There is a misconception that all of these thrusting swords at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries were only good as pokers, only good practically for tent pegging or for lance, essentially, as a one-handed or a short lance, a wearable lance. And that's not really true, and it's certainly, I would say, not true in the case of this Swedish M1893. So this is a good sword, and this is a palash, and this is actually not very different to certain types of 17th century sword that we find, and it is a cut and thrust blade. So whilst you can cut a little bit, very, very poorly, with the British blade here. This is very thrust-centric. One of the first swords to come along in the 19th century of this kind of generation that started this trend of thrusting swords for cavalry was this M1893. And this is actually not really a fully dedicated thrusting blade. Yes, on the surface of it, it is straight, it is long, but I tell you, this has got some heft to it. Man, this handles like certain types of 17th and 18th century backsword and broadsword. It feels somewhat like a Highland claymore or a basket hilted broadsword. This has got heft to it, okay? And I should point out that whilst this has got a very different balance, the British 1908 or 1912, this has got a very different balance and balanced much more back towards the hand. This is also a heavy weapon, but it's not as heavy as the 1893. This thing, you could do a fearsome chop with this. Now, whilst it's not primarily set up for that, it is clearly set up primarily to be riding along quickly and give point with. It is nevertheless capable. If you get into a melee, it's got potentially two edges. It is a double-edged blade with a fuller up the centre. Absolutely able to give all sorts of cuts with a lot of power. And this is a big blade. I haven't actually measured it, but that's got to be 37 inches, I would think, because I think the British one's 35. So this is a big, broad, heavy blade, cut and thrust. Let's talk briefly about the hilt. There's actually very little that's remarkable or notable about the Swedish hilt, apart from one thing which I really like, and it's symmetrical. Okay, symmetrical hilts mean that they rotate very nicely in the hand, they're well balanced, they're not heavier on one side than the other, and this helps with edge alignment. And it was a common criticism in the 19th century, despite the fact that they kept doing it, it was a common criticism in the 19th century that a lot of sword hilts were more protective on the right hand side than the left, because most of your hand is on the right hand side, assuming you're right handed. But that leads to a twist, or can lead to a twist in the cut, because the mass wants to go downwards on that side, respond to gravity essentially. It's also got inertia, so when you move the sword it doesn't have the same inertia in both directions. It has more inertia on one side than on the other. So generally speaking, for edge alignment, it's better to have a symmetrical hilt, if not necessarily for hand protection. It protects the inside. This actually doesn't have very much hand protection on the outside, and if we just swap back to the British 1912, you'll see that's completely settled by the 1912 or 1908 pattern. It's a huge guard, massive guard on the British sword, very, very protective, but the British guard is slightly asymmetrical. It does project more on the right hand side than the left, which is not necessarily a problem with this sword because you're not really going to be cutting with it very much. The other thing that's interesting about this sword is very often when we see these thrusting models like the 1912, we have an elongated grip with a place for the thumb, and the Swedish haven't really made contingency for that at all. It's a relatively short grip. I can get my thumb up it, but there's certainly no extra space, and my thumb almost jams into the bottom there. So for a thrusting sword, it's a relatively confined and constricted grip. And equally, there's no solid thumb placer on the back. It's quite a narrow back strap and quite rounded. So the thumb isn't very secure on there. If we compare it to the British 1912 in this case, but the same for the 08, you've actually got a very broad, flattened area with a recess for the thumb in there, so the thumb is not going to go anywhere. And equally, it's a very long and canted grip, so the canted grip gives you the natural point on alignment, and the thumb placer keeps that absolutely secure. The Swedish sword is a completely uncanted grip. The grip is in a straight line with the blade. I'll talk about that in a second. And there is no security for the thumb, and it's not lengthened either for that grip. The advantage to this is it's better for cutting, because if you look at the grip this way, it looks quite broad. You look at it that way and you can see it's quite thin. So you've got a very flat grip, which is actually very, very good for giving cuts. In terms of thrusts, one of the disadvantages of having a straight grip is it's more difficult to get the point on line. It's actually better to invert the sword to get the point on line. It's not so easy to get the point on line that way without really opening up the wrist. But in terms of energy transference, this is actually better, because the energy coming down the blade is in a straight line with the grip and with the tang. Okay, so you can put your whole arm and everything into a straight line. You do actually get a slight, when you've got a pistol grip, you get a slight deflection because you've got an angle here in the tang. There were other models of European sword that came along that were based, or not based on the 1893. There was one, I'll talk about that in a second. All of you Americans watching, pay attention. But there was the French 1896, there was the British 1908, which actually had started development closer to 1900. They've been trying to find a new type of sword. Most of the designs were thrusting designs. And there was a general movement around Europe towards these thrusting blades for the aforementioned reasons. But the Swedish one, the M1893, was really the first one of this general type that actually came into production and came into service use. Did it see any service use? I actually don't know, because I don't know Swedish history very well, but I don't think so. The Swedes tended to stay out of most most external conflicts at that point. But nevertheless, it is a serious fighting weapon. And I should also just mention on Swedish swords as a whole, I know I've got plenty of Swedish viewers, and I've got a whole bunch of Swedish friends, and I've spent some time in Sweden doing HEMA things. And Swedish 19th century swords, just as a group, are very interesting things because they're very individualistic, and they're not really particularly influenced by other nations. They're certainly not just copying other nations' designs. The Swedes had very much their own mindset of how certain designs, certain swords should be designed. So the Swedish cutlasses, the Swedish infantry swords, the Swedish cavalry swords, they only really look like Swedish swords. They're very individualistic and specific designs. And I've got to say, I'm a big fan both of the quality of Swedish weapons. Everyone knows that Swedish steel is very good quality. It's why the Germans used so much of it in World War II. But Swedish steel is very good quality, and Swedish manufacturing is very high quality, and their designs were really cool as well. So if you're interested in learning about a new area of 19th century weapons, if you don't know them already, then go and have a look at Swedish swords and cutlasses. Very interesting things. What I really wanted to say was that there are a lot of misconceptions about this sword, and people think of it only as a poker, when actually, when compared to later swords, which really practically are only pokers, it's actually not. It's actually really what I would term a broadsword or a military rapier. Some people might even go, oh Matt, is it like a side sword? Well, it's kind of heavier than most side swords are. And the other thing I wanted to say as well is it's not the revolutionary new design that some people have painted it as, or this whole family of swords. If we go back to the 17th century, what were those hussars armed with? They were armed with a bow or a gun, they were armed with a curved slashing sabre, and they were armed with an S-stock. Okay, and if we look at cuirassiers in the 19th century, in the 17th century, what were they armed with? They were armed with palashes. And that's what this is. This is not really a new or revolutionary design. This is basically a heavy cavalry palash, okay, that can be used predominantly as a thrusting sword, but can be really effectively used as a cutting sword. Very effective cutter, big, powerful blade. So for American viewers watching, you'll be aware that in 1913, a new model of sword came in for the US cavalry, and that is known as the US Patton sabre. Now, regular viewers of this channel will know that I'm not a fan of calling straight swords sabres, because in British terminology we tend to call a straight sword a sword, and we tend to call a curved sword a sabre. And when we say sabre, we mean a curved sword. However, the US military was heavily influenced by the French military, and in French military terminology, anything with a hilt, generally of sabre type, they called that sword a sabre, regardless of whether the blade was straight or curved. So the US called that sword, it's commonly called in the US, the US Model 1911 sabre. In the UK, we'd more correctly call it a sword. But nevertheless, that model of sabre, which was partially designed by General Patton, later General Patton, he was a less senior officer at the time, and he was a very practiced swordsman and took a big interest in swords back at this time, before the First World War. And he was essentially called in to consult, I believe, on a committee that were designing a new US cavalry sword. Now, he didn't design the whole sword, and this seems to be a common misconception that Patton designed the sword himself because his name has become attached to it. My understanding is that it was partially designed by committee, and then there were some kind of disagreements in the committee, as there often are in committees designing swords. Same thing happened in Britain. With the design of the 1908. But Patton was brought in, and Patton was influential over some elements of its design, if not the whole thing. But to cut a long story short, the US Model 1911 Patton blade is very clearly modelled on the Swedish M1893. So it seems that pretty much they took this blade and stuck it onto a new hilt. Now, some people have incorrectly, I think, said that the US M1913 Patton sabre is modelled on the British 1908 or 1912, and I don't really think it is, other than to say that, as I've said in this video, there was a general movement at this time for European and American powers to move towards swords that were fairly large thrusting swords, basically. So I think, other than it being part of that general movement, I don't think that the hilt of the Patton sabre is really based on the 1908, the British sword at all, although it may have been tangentially kind of influenced slightly by it. It does seem that the US hilt, the Model 1911, is very much its own thing, and it doesn't really look particularly like any of the other swords which had come out in recent years. You could possibly argue that the guard is a little bit similar in shape overall to the British one, but I don't really think so. I think there's enough differences there to say that no, it's just part of this general European movement towards these types of swords. But what I would say is that I think that despite the fact that the Patton sabre the Model 1911 uses essentially the Swedish Model 1893 blade design, although in my experience the American swords tend to be lighter than this Swedish sword. They tend to be a bit narrower and thinner. Although the basic blade design is taken from the Swedish sword, this actual Swedish sword is really at the beginning of that movement which led towards the specialised big hilted thrusting swords, and this is kind of like earlier swords. So despite the fact that this dates from 1893, if you gave me this sword and said, oh, well, this sword is, it's not a Model 1893 from Sweden, it's actually, it's a Swedish prototype that was made in the 1860s, I'd look at it and I'd go, okay. Because there's nothing particularly about this sword which screams end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. In its hilt construction, its guard design, the style of the grip, how the grip is made, the materials and everything else, and even the blade, a double-edged, narrow-fullered, straight broadsword blade, essentially. None of these things really scream end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, or new or revolutionary. As I say, in many, many ways, this sword harks back to types of sword which had been around for a long time before. The guard is somewhat similar to earlier Austrian guards. The grip is like basically every 19th century grip, for every type of 19th century sword grip. And the blade is just a broadsword blade, like you'd find on even some medieval swords. So anyway, I hope that's been useful and interesting. If you haven't subscribed already, please think about doing so, and click that notification bell if you are a subscriber. Give us a like, and I will see you really soon again on Schola Gladiatoria channel for another video talking about swords or armour or weapons or something to do with history, probably. See you soon, folks.